So hi everyone, my name is Abby Courier and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I am so excited to see everyone on here tonight and I look forward to learning more this evening about a village in the 60s, leaving Rollingstone. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County in southeastern Minnesota. We're so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Kevin Fenton on a village in the 60s, the story of what happens when the world changes. After his presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, feel free to put any questions that you might have in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. But before we can get started, I do want to go over a couple of logistical things for this evening. For tonight, we are going to ask all of you to remain muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions, put them in the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. There's a little message icon and you can click that. And then we will get to them towards the end of the presentation. We may also put some links in the chat throughout the night, so make sure you keep an eye on it. That we put into the chat, we will be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a brief survey about tonight's program. It only takes 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter's view, but if you want to see everyone participating Brady Bunch style, you can do that by clicking on the view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you are joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe a couple of times to change the view. We are recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We're so excited about tonight's talk, and we hope that you'll continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from railroads to Lost Rochester, to housing covenants, and everything in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits of having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by Kevin Fenton, who was raised in the farm country and river towns of southeastern Minnesota. He lives in St. Paul with his wife Ellen and his greyhound Evie. He got degrees from Beloit College, the University of Minnesota Law School, and the University of Minnesota Master of Fine Arts program. He currently works in advertising. Kevin?
Thank you. I want to first of all simply say thank you. And I also want to bring up a technical issue here, which is that I'm receiving a notice that says this meeting is being recorded. Are other people seeing that as I share my screen, or is that just on my screen?
That's just on your screen, so there might be like a little bubble in the upper left-hand corner.
Okay.
Saying it's recorded, but otherwise it looks perfectly fine.
Okay, great. So with that, I want to say thanks. I also want to, because if a joke works for me, I always reuse it until it no longer works for me. I do want to say that it was slightly disconcerting to have a historical society ask me to talk about my memoir, which makes me realize that I am now, in fact, history. But it's also a great honor to do it, and it's a great honor to speak here tonight. I want to say a couple things about this before I get into it, because once I get into it, it should flow pretty well. The first is that this is not a balanced summary of the book. This has been repurposed for this particular event, and that was actually a very interesting challenge. The second thing I want to say is that because it is based on a book, I wanted to capture some of the language of the book. And I've done a lot of PowerPoints, and I've thought a lot about PowerPoint, and I know that reading a PowerPoint slide is not often the best practice, but in this case, I believe it is the best practice. And so that there will be very small snippets, which will be a component of the reading mixed within my larger presentation. So with that, and a general plug, which is that please about the survey that Abby mentioned, that I know that helps them a lot. So if you could bother to do that, that'd be fantastic. With that, I'll get started. The title here is A Village in the 60s. This is based on my memoir, Leaving Rollingstone. For those of you who do not know where Rollingstone is, it is about, and I think most of you probably would, but it's a small town. I don't want to overestimate that. It is about 40 miles roughly west of Rochester and about 10 miles roughly north, roughly east of Rochester and about 10 miles roughly northwest of Winona. It's just off the Mississippi River, but it does not have any access to the river. When I was born in 1959 in the village of Rollingstone, our family consisted of my father and my 4 siblings. We owned a farm. Rollingstone had its own Catholic school, which served the entire village. But it's interesting, I've got this thing on my screen, so I can't see the middle of my screen, unfortunately. Is there a way to make that go away? It's the one thing I can't touch, Abby.
It shouldn't still be there. I haven't had that complaint from anyone else.
Yeah, that's odd.
Give me 1 second. Do you mind if I look at your computer?
Not at all.
Okay, so I just requested the remote view.
Okay. Yeah, and that's why for some reason can't, my cursor cannot, I'm gonna go escape. I can't go escape. This is, here we go. And I might, so.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything on your screen about the recording.
Okay, no, and I got rid of it. What I had to do was hit escape.
Okay.
So I'm now gonna go back to play. And we should be back.
Did that work?
Yes.
Excellent.
We're good. By the time I was in 8th grade, we had lost the farm, the town had lost its school, and my father had died. I wanted to get this, so that's the basic story here in 3 sentences. Obviously, this affected me personally a fair amount. I think in some ways it affected others. I was in a position where I've been able to write about it and capture it, but in some ways it affected others far more. And I think, and the more I thought about it, the more it has larger implications. I've been reading a book in the past couple of weeks called A Time to Build by a political theorist named Yuval Levine. And he talks about the role of institutions in society and how they're intermediaries which humanize us. And I've been thinking about that. I think the story of Rollingstone has larger implications as well. One way to view the story of Rollingstone, which is what the A Time to Build book gave me, is what happens to human lives when human institutions disappear. We were not unhappy people. We were happy people. Some bad things happened too. The reason I wrote that, and the reason I've included the section called The Golden Age, is because when I condensed this down to a PowerPoint, the story became darker. There was much more levity in the extended book. And so I wanted to acknowledge that at the beginning and capture some of it. I want to minimize one thing if I can. There we go.
Kevin, you're on mute.
Okay. There we go. Actually, the irony is I was apologizing for technical difficulties while I was on mute. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the happiness that my family felt. Mom and Dad used to go dancing in the Altura Fire Hall on Saturday nights in the 1950s. Mom was a timid, tentative dancer because the priest had told her that dancing at non-Catholic events was a mortal sin. So the whole evening, Dad would hold her by the waist and carry her around the floor, reassuring her, "Holly, I've got you." On Sunday night, we made Chef Boyardee pizza, and the cheery primary colors of the 60s blazed in our kitchen. The mix in our bright yellow bowl prepared in a bright the mix in a bright yellow box prepared in a bright yellow bowl. Pepsi fizzed like a discotheque. And Dennis and the girls taunted each other with talk that felt like the bubbles rising and rioting in the pop. That energy also fizzed in the music that was always on in our house, in the TV shows we loved, in Maureen singing The Lion Sleeps Tonight, in manic games of kickball and twister, summer rides along our field roads, and in our pickup when Maureen would drive and the rest of us would take turns sitting on the tailgate, the dirt and grass streaming below us like rapids, our stomachs lightning and tickling. Catholicism was our calendar and our clock, and I realized we were really Catholic when I revisited this. We attended Mass on Sunday and numerous holidays such as the Ascension and some weekday Masses. We said the Rosary on Saturday nights. We dipped our hands in holy water, tasted communion host, and inhaled incense. We were taught by nuns and forgiven by priests. We gave up TV and candy for Lent and the Advent wreaths in December. Crucifixes with a dying Christ hung in every house and classroom. And I should point out that is a distinctly Catholic thing. Many Protestant crucifixes do not show Christ on the cross. And the high school taught Latin, and that was the only language it taught, was Latin. And I want to talk a little bit about our farm, but I first wanted to establish we were in many ways a very happy family. And in some ways that made the pain of what we lost more pronounced, but I wanted to capture that happiness. Our farm was about 360 acres. That's not a big farm, but it's not a hobby farm. It's a real farm and we depended on it for our living. Also wanted to point out that farming is always precarious, that there is no farm which isn't, simply because of the vagaries of weather and economics. That farming is a fairly precarious business to begin with, but our farms faced some special challenges which are unique to us, which I want to capture here. Between 1960 and 1970, my father would have 12 hip replacements. My mother would pack his suitcase of 48 times and drink, on average, 17 cups of coffee a day. When my brother Dennis was in 8th grade, he asked Sister Conrad if he could flunk. By the way, Sister Conrad was the principal of the school. He was a good student, but he had a farm to run, and his life would be much easier if he didn't have school to worry about. I simply ask you for contrast to think about the 8th graders we know for that, or to think about myself in 8th grade. The school. Holy Trinity was a single school which taught kids in grades 1 through 12. Classes were small, so almost never over 20, barely over 10. And it had a couple of really unique characteristics. One is that it was very Catholic. And the first slide I'm going to share kind of emphasizes sort of how Catholic it was. And it had, because of that, it had a very intense sense of mission. The second thing, though, is that it was at the same time, it was very, very fun. This was the 1960s, and teenagers were like gods. And as a first and second grader, it was really fun to go to school with teenagers because they seemed to be, a different species and like way cooler than the rest of us were. And the third thing about the school was that it had a certain a gravity to it. And I mean that in more of a literal sense, although it didn't actually attract objects to it. But I don't mean gravity in the sense that it was serious or grave. I mean gravity in the sense that it had a magnetic quality to it that attracted people to it. People had reasons to come there, and it served as the center of the town. An unsigned document in the Winona County Historical Society outlined the accomplishment of Holy Trinity School. By 1954, it had graduated only 256 students, yet it had, quote, given to the church 8 priests, 20 sisters, 1 brother, 1 seminarian, now in 2nd philosophy. 1 out of every 8 students who graduated from Holy Trinity became a priest, nun, or brother. The other thing that I just noted about that is that this was written by a layperson who knew what 1 seminarian in 2nd philosophy meant, which is a highly technical term about Catholic priestly training. Dennis played basketball for Holy Trinity. The whole family and much of the town attended every home game. Even is played by Class C farm boys. And by the way, that's a technical definition of what the school size was. Even is played by Class C farm boys. The game had its essential charms. The texture of the game itself is sweaty as a locker room and as bright as a stage. The echoing, agitated crowd, the trembling bleachers, the controversies of fouls, the recital-like isolation of free throws, the mathematical otherworldliness of a perfectly arced shot, the zephyr-like exhilaration of fast breaks, which is going to make this next bit more painful. On December 22nd, 1966, the Winona Daily News reported that Holy Trinity School would close. The diocese believed that there was no possibility of giving the kind of terminal education necessary for people not going to college, or to offer, quote, the many courses for the college-bound student in the field of physics and chemistry. I'm going to keep this on an emotional level because I don't think I speak about it fairly rationally on a policy level. This just really hurt people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that meant. Colleen and Sheila lost their high school. I should point out Dennis's class was the last to graduate, and my sister Marina graduated 2 years before. So one of their peers said that he and his friends spent those years stoned, but his wasn't the expected celebratory man. The 60s were something tone. 25 years later, he said he had never been more depressed. The language of most of Colleen's friends was the bruised, baffled language of children who'd been through a divorce. It was the language of children whose most intimate culture had been destroyed. That is the short history of the school. Next topic I want to talk about is villages. I had in many ways the good fortune to live in 2 villages 3 miles apart, which were very different places. As I talked about Rollingstone, it was a place where there was it was the center of life for an area. Minnesota City was in some ways the opposite. It was a collection of roads and a very diminished actual village. And it just didn't have the same energy to it. It was even though it was less than 1,000 people, it served essentially as a suburb of Winona. I'll catch us up on our story. We lost the farm when I was in 4th grade and we moved to Minnesota City. When I was in 8th grade, my dad passed. The novelist and critic Wilfred Sheed wrote of Los Angeles that it seemed wrong to have so many people and not have a city. Peddling in search of Minnesota City, it seemed wrong to have so few people and not have a village, because I really couldn't find kind of the emotional center of the place. Villages tug life toward them. In Rollingstone, farmers drove to the creamery, to the feed mill, to the lumber yard, to the bank, to the co-op gas station, to the general store, to the dry goods store, to the park, to the chick hatchery. And these comings and goings, this buildup of hellos and errands, these luminous threadings created something. Epilogue. I now kind of want to, I think that it's a good idea in a live presentation to catch people up to the present day. I can't read this, but I know it. I know what it says, which is Mom passed away at the age of 89 in 2012. She once told me, when facing a major life decision, that life is hard and we need a supportive community and the guideposts of a tradition. What's interesting is I disagreed with her about that particular life decision, but that advice has stayed with me ever since. And I think it somehow reflects what she learned in Rollingstone and kind of how it shaped her. She was buried in Rollingstone Cemetery, less than 100 yards from where she was baptized. That is her on the left with me, and that is her on the right with our greyhound, Albert. And in the last thing that my mom said to me, because she loved that dog, and this was 2 years before the Pope said it, was that she had been thinking, and although the current Catholic dogma at the time was that dogs did not have souls, she decided that she disagreed with that, and she was going to see our dogs in heaven. My brother and my sisters and I are still on very good terms, but we are, like many American families, diaspora spread over 3 states. That is them on the left in the 1950s, I think right before I was born, and that is them on the right at Mom's funeral in 2012. After Holy Trinity closed, the school continued as a public elementary school, eventually in a new building until that was closed in 2018. Thanks to the efforts of the people of Rollingstone, the school will reopen as a charter school in 2022. And I just absolutely admire the dedication that made that happen. I was not a part of that. I wish I had been. I want to end with a closing thought, which opens this up a little bit, because so far I've told my story. I think my story has a deeper resonance. And this is a return to the book I talked about earlier and suggest a way of framing it. In A Time to Build, the political theorist Yuval Levine suggests that much of our current soul sickness, our horrible mix of personal loneliness and digital tribalism, could be eased by stronger institutions. I want to explain a little bit what he means by institutions. It is anything with a structure, with an ideal, with a history, and with the ability to do things. And I think by that definition, that schools, farms, of families, and even villages are institutions. And his thinking is that they make us more human. And they do this by teaching us patience with our fellow people as we try to work in them, by structuring our thought as we try to work in them, by giving us a chance for belonging and recognition. I do want to note that he is not a naive man, and he also talks about the ways, and he gets very specific about the ways institutions have failed us and the ways in which institutions can oppress people. But he believes there may be a way forward for us. So given that, I want to ask the question, what do we lose when villages atrophy and when schools close? What do we gain when we reinvigorate those places, and can we? Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you would like to ask it in person, you can use the little reactions button down at the bottom of your screen and raise your hand. and I'll be keeping an eye out for those. And I'd like to start with a question, Kevin, and you probably cover this in your book, but what does your family do after you lose the farm and move to Minnesota City?
My father, unfortunately, had to go on disability there. He did have a couple of jobs because he was a complete, one thing about my father is he was a gamer. He actually had a postal route delivering mail from, he'd drive to Rochester early in the morning and drive back to Winona with the mail for that day. He did that for a while. He also sold vacuum cleaners door to door for a while, and he was not a natural salesman, but he was a man who just kept trying. And if you are not, even if you are suited to that work, it's really hard. And most of us are not suited to it, but he always kept trying. And then he passed away when I was in 8th grade. My mom absolutely soldiered on. She realized when she died, she was 50 years old with most of our savings having gone into, having been lost with the farm. And she just kept working until the age of 63 or 64 as a nurse. That's hard work in your 60s. She lived until she was 89. We eventually moved into Winona, which is where I went to high school. And that's kind of how we continued.
Did she work as a nurse at Mayo or at a closer hospital?
Yeah, she worked actually in the Winona Hospital.
Okay.
Yeah, she was an obstetrics nurse. She once did some math and figured she delivered 10,000 babies.
All right.
And her stock response whenever people remembered her, but she could not remember them in most instances, was to tell them they had a very beautiful baby. And she said they never once disagreed with her and she was never wrong.
So you talk about the school closing in Rollingstone. Did the church also close or was it just the school?
No, the church continues. The church is in some ways diminished in that it used to have masses on, and I checked this out this summer because I wanted to kind of check up on this. It used to have one mass on Saturday night and 2 masses on Sunday, and then weekday masses. And it no longer has weekday masses, and it has a single mass on Saturday night. The same priest then holds in, I believe, in 2 Sunday masses in other nearby villages. So it still has continued, but I know that some of the people have left it and joined other congregations, which made me sad.
So how would you characterize Rollingstone today? Do you think it is a resilient community or an endangered community?
That's a really good question. I think it's both. And that may be a cop-out, but I love it, so that's what I'm going to call it. Which is that the mere fact that they got that small towns are always having their schools closed, and they were always threatened with that. But they kept it open as a 6th grade elementary school when some of the neighboring towns had either 3 or 4 grade elementary schools. And after it was closed, they got together a charter school. So in that sense, I think the same drive that formed the town originally is still there. So I think it's a resilient community, but I think it misses what it once was.
Was the farm or other farms that may have been lost in Rollingstone, do you know what happened to them? Like, were they bought up by developers or?
Question. Actually, it's not a good, it's not a good place for corporate farming, at least not in the sense that we understand it, because it's so hilly. What happened actually is, and I'm not an expert in agricultural economics, this is just talking with some friends of mine from Rollingstone. What happens actually is more of a consolidation, which is that our farm was purchased by the Herbers, who were 2 brothers who owned farms next to us. And one of them bought it. And now they had a total of, two of them unfortunately died before reaching adulthood, but they had a total of like 6 sons. And four of them now farm closely connected farms. So actually what happened is the farms have gotten a little larger. They used to be more like 300 acres to 500 acres. They're now, with 1,000 being big, they're now larger than that. And they milk many more cows. We milk like maybe 35 cows at our top. They will milk 150 to 200. And they're much, and so that on a small scale, there are efficiencies they've created. But they are still what we would recognize as a family farm. They're just larger family farms.
Do you know how many people are still in Rollingstone?
I think actually the population has stayed relatively stable around 600.
Okay.
Because one thing it has become is it's become more like Minnesota City in that people from Winona have found it attractive and have moved to it. So people, so in some sense, it is now partly a bedroom community for Winona.
These are questions coming from the chat. You mentioned your brother asking the nun if he was allowed to fail out of 8th grade. Was he allowed to?
He was not. He was not. So she's like, no, Dennis, you're not allowed to do that. I do think that actually I spoke with her. She was in the, when I was writing the book, this is in the early 2010s, I was able to, I called the, I don't want to call it by the name we casually called it by. It's a place for older nuns in Rochester. And I was able to contact her there. And she was in her early 80s. And she spoke with me about the closing of the school. And she said she opposed it. And she resigned a year early because of it. Because she thought there was still support and that they were just trying to be cheap. And I think that's a little harsh, given the immense pressures on the church at the time. But she then went on to head Catholic Charities in Winona. But my guess is she told the nuns to cut Dennis a little slack.
Makes sense. Why do you think people need to hear these stories, and why is it important?
That's a really good question. And I should be able to answer. It's so basic, I should be able to answer it readily. But it's also so basic that I can't answer it quickly. It's like, why do we breathe?
We got plenty of time, so we can go into that too if you want.
Oh, that may be even harder. I think it is important to tell these stories. I think first of all, we should know our past and we should know it as accurately as possible. And I think there's a real function of memoir, because what memoir does is one thing that people would ask me, and they'd phrase it in code, which is interesting because you pick up on the code fairly quickly. They're like, are you old enough to write a memoir? And I was plenty old to write a memoir at the time. What they were saying is, have you accomplished enough to write a memoir? Because the classic memoir is, I'm Colin Powell, and these are the wonderful things I've done, and this is my story. That's one kind of memoir. The second kind of memoir, which is a witness to history, which is what I was writing, this isn't really about me. I happen to be there. There's a wonderful Margaret Atwood line, which is, she said, the most important line in the Bible for a writer is, I alone have escaped to the holy. That it's about, I do think it's important to understand what we were, because for one thing, some of those cycles repeat and some of those same issues come up. And also that Rollingstone was an experiment. And in some ways it was an experiment which on its terms, I think the people who founded it would say it failed, because it's no longer the Catholic community it once was. But while it was there, I think it produced some really interesting results. It also oppressed some people. I want to make clear about that. But it also produced a lot of meaning for a lot of people. And I think simply looking at it as a model is a good idea.
What has been the reaction to your book in Rollingstone?
In Rollingstone, it's generally been positive. Actually, it's been very positive. The funniest thing was because it was even positive about some things I didn't expect it to be positive about. Because one thing I didn't talk about in this talk, which I mentioned in the book, is that because the school was the only school, they didn't have to pay property taxes to the school district. That they didn't have to fund the public school. And so they technically had one. It was 2 chairs and a closet. And partly because of that, and partly because it was so strictly Catholic, when Protestants thought about moving into town, they were taken aside and asked not to. They weren't like roughed up or anything, but they were simply told, this isn't a good idea. And I talked to some of the older guys about that. I said, I'm so, I hope that didn't hit a nerve. And they were very funny about it. And what they said is, no, we were just doing the Lord's work. Don't worry about it. Which I thought was funny. But what they did say is what bothered us is, and I don't know if I can show you this. If you look at the book, they said, why did you put that communist tractor on the cover? Because everybody in Rollingstone drove a John Deere. This is, it doesn't have a label, but it's a case. And so tractor loyalties are extremely strong there. And that's been the only criticism. For the most part, people are very proud that somebody has written a book about their experience. And some people have said, I've been trying to explain that this was real to my grandchildren for 30 years. And I was able to show them that a book written by somebody who wasn't me says this was real. And so overall, it's been a very positive experience.
So do you tie, I don't want to use the word collapse, but the degradation of like that golden era to the closing of the school?
Yes. Yeah, I think that it was fed partly by, because agricultural practices changed a little, and it was fed by often you'll find a very small change will make a much larger change than you think. Mm-hmm. That a small thing, and people who've lived on farms can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but a small thing is sometime in the mid-60s, people changed from bringing their milk into town to having a bulk tank come out and pick it up. And that meant that farmers did not go into town as regularly. I think that hurt it a little bit. But I think the big blow to it was the closing of the school.
So when the school closed, where did all the children go? Because I assume the closet wasn't big enough for them.
It was not. We fed a lot in there. It's surprisingly more than you'd think. But the first through sixth graders stayed in there was a public, they replaced the Catholic elementary school with a public elementary school. And we went there. They actually, and in some ways this is kind of sad, because of where Rollingstone was located, they split it. And if you lived on a certain side of the line, you went to either to Winona Junior High and high schools. And if you lived on a different side of the line, you went to Lewiston high schools. So that's the high schools in Lewiston and Winona picked it up.
What do you make of the rural-urban divide in today's politics?
It's very strong. I mean, and all the demographics and all the statistics say it's very strong. I do think that it's, actually, I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. There are people I know in Rollingstone who I have wonderful conversations with, and there are people I can barely talk to anymore. And that was never the case. And I hope we can do some things to overcome it, but I am not sure what it is. That's for a smarter person than me to figure that out. It disturbs me because I grew up with those people and I love those people. I do think we have that. One of the points that Levine was making is that one of our problems now is we are on a very personal level more isolated than ever before. Far fewer Americans have a best friend than used to be. Far more of us feel alone than we were even 10 years ago. So on a very personal, kind of physical level, we're very alone. But on a digital level, we're very connected. And those things, I think, make the divide worse. I think that if people had more associations, I think the divide would be less. And I hope that happens.
Okay. We had some other questions come in. So when was Rollingstone founded and by whom?
Okay, that's actually a part I didn't get into because it wasn't immediately germane, but it's pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. It was founded in, I believe, the 1850s, maybe a little later than that. And it was founded by immigrants from Luxembourg. There was an economic depression in Luxembourg, and that caused many of the young people to leave. It remained a Luxembourg community. Our family was Irish. The Kendrick family of 14 children, an actual percent, more than a percentage of the residents of Rollingstone was German. But other than that, everyone, when I was in grade school, everyone else was a Luxembourger. And I used to joke to my friends in Rollingstone that until I was 12, I thought goddamn Luxembourger was a single word because my dad said it all the time. So it was founded in the 1850s by Luxembourger immigrants, and it remained a predominantly Luxembourger community throughout the 1960s. I think that has since changed. So yeah, that's kind of its story.
So what do you think the loyalty to tractor brands and the feedback you got about the case replica say about the power of institutions?
It's interesting. What it says a lot about, actually, it says that really strong brands are like institutions in some ways. They don't allow us agency, but they do allow us a sense of belonging, which is that I am on it, because there is a human kind of need to sort of say, because the loyalties are strong. They were very strong to John Deere, and where they were pretty unanimous, but not completely unanimous. And they were also very strong, I remember, between Chevy and Ford. That either you simply drove Chevys or you simply drove Fords. You did not go back and forth between those. And I think what it really is about is identity, which is partly its function, which is John Deere's are good tractors. But partly it's, this is who I am. And it's also about nostalgia, that when we purchased a home and I had to buy a lawnmower, I drove 70 miles to Red Wing to make sure it was a John Deere mower because I could not find one in the metro. So there is a sense of identity. I think institutions are much more dynamic than that. They allow you to do things. They allow you to meet with people. They allow you to have agendas and accomplish things. But they also serve as a sense of identity. And I think brands, besides doing what they're supposed to do, which is to give you a sense that, oh, this cup of coffee was made by this company, I can assume certain things about it. That's their very legitimate function, which as an ad guy, I'll defend. And I explain to people the difference. I explain to people what brands are by saying this. Both Apple and Microsoft are going to build a car. What do we know about the car? Which is, a brand is what you know about the product before you know anything about the product. And I think that's a legitimate function of a brand. But they're also, what do you know about the person before you know anything about the person? And I think that's a less healthy attribute of a brand.
Do you know why they chose the name Rollingstone?
It's actually from I want to make sure I get this right. I believe in southeastern Minnesota, they're referred to as Lakota. It's a Lakota word. That actual spot was named Rollingstone, and they simply translated it into English.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hilly, and I guess stones roll around.
I was hoping for some great story about like the first pioneer had this giant boulder they had to push out of the way and it just kept rolling down the hills.
No, nothing. Just that's what the local Indians called it, so that's what they called it. So
Not sort of Greek myths trying to push the stone up the hill.
no, that would actually be much more appropriate. Yeah.
Especially for farmers, right? Trying to get all those stones out of.
That's true. And there was a shirt which I no longer have, but I want to buy again, which says it's a T-shirt that they sell in the cafe, which says before there was the band, before there was the magazine, there was the town.
So in general, when growing up, was it a goal for you to stay in Rollingstone or to get out as fast as you could?
That was actually one of the most interesting revelations of writing the book, because you think you're going to write a book to say what you know, and you actually write a book to find out what you know, or to find out what you really think. And I had thought that we lost Rollingstone, and I always kind of wished I could go back to it, and then I kind of lost something very special, and it was very special, and we did lose it, but I also realized, no, I was going to leave Rollingstone for the cities. And what I realized is I wanted to break up with Rollingstone before it broke up with me. And that when I lost it, it became even more valuable. But I don't think I'm not a farmer, and that's the main way to make a living. I'm just not good at it. All those genes went to my brother. So.
Is he still farming somewhere?
Actually, he's not, which is sad. He served in Vietnam in the late 60s. And when he came back, there wasn't a farm for him. So he moved to Washington State. He made a career. He's first as a UPS driver and then as a UPS manager, and also raised 5 adopted children as well. So he takes care of things. That's what Dennis does. Mm-hmm. If you're in trouble, Dennis will take care of you.
That's a good kind of person to have.
It really is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is the farmhouse in Rollingstone still standing?
Unfortunately, no. And we actually discovered that when I was in high school. The Herbers, and this is their prerogative, they own the land. They tore it down and built a split level.
And can you talk a little bit more about the process of writing the book? Like, how long did it take? Who did you talk to? Was there people you wish you had been able to talk to?
Yes, it is, because it's very different from writing a novel. Because my first novel, like, you just get to make stuff up. It's fantastic. But with this, it was not a book of journalism. It was a book of witness. But I wanted to do 2 things. I wanted to get those facts which I could get right. I wanted to make sure I got right, because there are some subjective recollections you're not going to be able. I'm going to have this recollection. You're going to have that recollection. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to know if I can find. The school closed on a particular date. I want to find out what it is. So all the facts which can be verified, I wanted to make sure were verified. And I worked some with Winona County Historical Society on that. I got some help from people at the Winona Daily News about that. And I also talked to some people in Rollingstone about that to kind of confirm some things. The other thing is that a memoir like this will be the only time certain people's story is told, and I wanted them to have some voice in it. So I did talk heavily to my brother and my mom about their perspective. They're actually quite different perspectives. I wasn't able to talk to my sister quite as much, and I think she had a slightly different perspective, although she supported the book quite a bit. Absolutely, no one has told me you have told a lie. You know, that this is not how it was. And I know some memoirs get that reaction, especially from family members. My family said there were certain subjective things we did not remember quite the way you remembered them. But what happened was Dennis said he remembered it this way, and Colleen said she remembered it that way. So it was simply the kind of thing that is sufficiently impressionistic. Everybody remembered it in a slightly different way. Mm-hmm. So in terms of researching it, I did talk to people, and I did do some research to check facts that I could check. And the one person I wanted to talk to that I wasn't able to was Sister Maureen, who taught me in 2nd and 4th grade.
So you said all of your siblings overall supported the book and their portrayal therein?
Yeah.
And so what are your other siblings doing? You mentioned that they were spread across 3 different states.
Yeah. My sister Sheila recently retired as a nurse at Abbott Northwestern Hospital. My sister Colleen worked because my mom worked as a nurse, and 2 of my sisters have. My sister Colleen worked as a nurse in Winona. Colleen also raised a family of 3 children with her husband in Winona. My sister Maureen raised 4 sons in Colorado with her husband Lowell. And my brother Dennis, I told you about, is living in Washington State, and he's a grandpa now.
All right. Was there anyone that didn't want to talk to you about your book?
Not really. No, I was actually surprised because I did think there are a couple of things. It's not a tell-all. It's not I don't bust people. Mm-hmm. And a couple of things that were more sensitive, I didn't give names. I tried to anonymize them, as the tech guys say, as much as possible. And there are 2 or 3 names I changed where it might be, they probably really wouldn't want that out.
What was the favorite story that you learned when writing the book? So not your own memories, but something you heard later.
That's a really good question, because they kind of blend, because once you've heard it enough, it becomes your memory. Mm-hmm. Because I know there were a couple of things my mom said, and I'm like, oh, I did not know that. But I wish I could remember something in particular. I can't.
That's okay. Did you do any research or get help from the local diocese, since, it, like you were saying, it's a prominently Catholic town? And
actually, I did not. And that is probably something I should have talked to, because it's relatively sympathetic to the diocese. And but what I was able to get is some good records at the Winona Historical Society.
Is there a story that you wish had made it into the book?
Not really. Although, actually, I now have remembered a story that, and it's not my favorite, it's actually a fairly dark story that I did not know about, which is my father, as I remembered him, was a guy who liked a beer. My brother, and this was confirmed by my mom, that earlier in their marriage and in my father's life, he had a relatively serious drinking problem. And there were a couple of stories about that I learned that my brother Dennis, again, when he was young, would be afraid Dad wouldn't come back to clean out the barn and get things ready. So he would as a fairly young boy, make sure everything was ready for Dad when he came back. And so that was the one thing that I didn't, because it had, my dad's drinking had moderated by the time I came along. And so I didn't understand quite what Dennis had to go through.
Mm-hmm. And just so I have the order right, are you the youngest of the five?
Yes, I'm the youngest to a fault. When I was in my 50s, my mother introduced me as her baby. So yeah, I was by about 6 years the youngest.
Okay. I mean, my brother's still introduced as the littlest and the youngest, and he's over 6 foot, so.
Yeah. Oh, another story I did learn, and this story I did like. I kind of like, even though it sounds sadistic, but it's actually kind of funny. My brother Dennis and my sister Maureen, in the short amount of time that my dad would have to go in to pick up my mom at work, because she learned to drive fairly late. So the time to drive in and back would have to watch me. And when I was a baby, or not much more than a baby, I was in a crib. And if I started to cry, they would evidently just bounce the bed as hard as they could. And what they later realized is that the reason I wasn't crying was I was having trouble breathing. But they thought it was a swell solution to their immediate problem. And I turned out fine. So I have like zero qualms about that. I now consider it kind of humorous that they're like, well, we are 12 and 14 years old, and this is our solution to this problem.
Mm-hmm.
That if Kevin keeps bouncing up and down, he can't cry too much.
What is the thing that you miss the most about Rollingstone?
Because I miss a lot. Actually, what I miss the most is sort of, and it's kind of how I opened the book, because I wanted to open with one of the best memories, is how our family used to have breakfast. Which is we had this kitchen, this big old farm kitchen with these metalwork air vents. And we'd all stand on them, and we'd stand on them like we were at the Stations of the Cross, like we were the various saints around church. And my mom would make cocoa and bring it to all of us, and make toast and bring it to all of us. And that's how we would have breakfast, standing in the kitchen, all up against the wall, which sounds really kind of isolated, like a Bergman movie, but was actually super cheerful.
And was this during the winter?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if everyone was just like assigned an air vent year round, and that's where.
No, I just have this very distinct memory in the winter that's how we had breakfast. Because you're right, that is not manageable in summer.
I had another question on the tip of my tongue. So is the town still predominantly Catholic?
I believe it is. There, the one thing is that some people have left for evangelical churches in Winona, and I think there may be some evangelical presence up in Lewiston as well, and are kind of they may go to another church, but they're a follower of a Pat Dobson or someone like that. So that I think it's less Catholic than it used to be, but it's still predominantly Catholic, and that is still the only church in town.
And is your father buried with your mother?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there traditions from the farm that you still keep up now? Like, do you still have that hot cocoa with toast?
I'll do things like that. I have a real soft spot for Vicks Vapor Rub, because my dad thought it like cured anything. And so I use Vicks far more often. My wife will testify to my very weird habit of occasionally wanting her to run a fan in winter. because our family used to do that. I don't know why we did it, but we thought that was, so the things that I remember are very odd, and I still have my mom's rosary right kind of behind me. I don't have it hanging here because I realize that in business meetings it may not be appropriate to have a rosary hanging directly behind me, but I still have a rosary.
Yeah, we normally have fans going, or I grew up in an old house in New Hampshire that's like 1800s, and we would have fans going. So we have one central heating location, and it makes the kitchen incredibly warm.
Yeah.
And the rest of the house freezes, so you have to like try and force the hot air into the rest of the building. So you don't have other traditions, like you're not out milking the cows and stuff?
No. Although I did realize I always take the morning dog walk.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I get up in the morning and I take care of animals. It's what I do.
Well, that's the time to take care of the animals.
Yeah.
In the morning.
Yeah.
So what kind of crops or animals did you guys produce on the farm?
We were a dairy farm, so we made the bulk of our money selling milk. We produced that milk by feeding the cows a combination of oats and hay and corn. I did not know enough about the economics of the farm to know if we also sold those things independently of that at all. But we're basically a dairy farm, and our basic crops were oats, hay, and corn. And towards the very end, we experimented some in soybeans.
Did you also grow crops just for your own consumption, or would you guys go to the market?
We had a wonderful garden. That is one of the benefits of farm life, is you can have really fantastic. We probably have about a half-acre garden, and we grew what everybody else grew. We grew squash, we grew pumpkins, we grew radishes, just all your basic garden stuff, and that was wonderful.
Yeah. Did your wife also grow up on a farm?
She did not. She grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
Okay. And what were some of the reasons that you lost the farm? Was it also because of your father's illness?
It basically was my father's illness he simply could not continue to farm it, and we weren't generating enough revenue, mm-hmm. and that the medical bills, which eventually got a very good lawyer who went on to become head of the Minnesota State Bar Association, Roger Brojnahan, and he helped us come to a settlement with the Mayo Clinic that it kept us from bankruptcy, but we had to sell the farm.
Okay. I think that's the last of our questions. Are there any other questions out there? I'm not seeing any pop up. So before we wrap up, I will mention that we have copies of Kevin Fenton's book, Leaving Rollingstone, here in our gift shop. And so in your email tomorrow morning, I'll have instructions on how you can purchase your own and learn more about this amazing village in the 60s. And I want to say thank you so much to our audience for asking so many great questions, and especially to our presenter for sharing his time and expertise with us this evening. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from just deeds to Med City history and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Great.